just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
We at war. We at war with terrorism, racism, but most of all, we at war with ourselves.
Boy, normally I like to be somebody who gets the opportunity to laugh and be joyous. We come from a very joyous people, but unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation in which there's nothing to be joyous about. What I'm talking about is what happened recently. There was there has been a docu-series released. And this docu-series was released by Prime Video as well as by the History Channel. And it features some very prominent people within our community, amongst our people. And the unfortunate aspect of this is that when it comes to the history that they are speaking of, this history is very much a fallacy. It's one created not by us, but it is being perpetuated by us. And it is something that has to stop. As a people, we were conquered in these lands. And it's important for us to know this because the road of conquest always requires a type of dumbing down of the population, a type of brainwashing. And this brainwashing goes deep, it goes long. All people have experienced it, any country, any people who are the byproduct of empire, such as France, for example, Germany, both the byproducts of being conquered by the Romans. The Germany was once called Gaul, while the Celtic people were in France. And so the reason we today recognize them as Germany and France is because this is what they eventually became named, specifically with France being named after Frankfurt, right? And so when we have people who are conquered, they are always given a new identity. It's not just our people. And in our case, we became these African Scotians. Fortunately, we have records of reality. We know who and what the status was of the indigenous people who were here when the explorers arrived. We know, for example, that the first explorer into our region was a man named Giovanni de Viserio. And what he said about the people who he encountered was, the men and women are dark-skinned, not unlike Ethiopians, and have thick black hair. He said this back in 1524. Second to the punch was the far more famous, well more renowned explorer Jacques Cartier, who, before his adventures down in Quebec, did stop here in Lumtig, and he said of us, they are gorged with certain tanned colors. Additionally, we had Samuel de Champlain, who also went down to Quebec, but eventually came back and came and stayed amongst us. He met Molputuk, whom some people Frankenized to his name to say member to, and when he was talking and writing in his notes, he said, the quote of us, all these people of Norumbega, or Lumteg, are swarthy, which is a term that we no longer use, but is translated to the word black. These are not accounts that we can afford to dismiss. These are not accounts of the people who are perceived to be indigenous today. And the perception is not necessarily a wrong one, because they do share some of our heritage and our blood. However, this farcical notion that our people, the so-called Black Nova Scotians, are in fact African is absurd. Why are historians perpetuating such nonsense? Why haven't they done the numbers? Why haven't they looked into the votes? We frequently, we've had Lawrence Hill discusses the Book of Negroes. And while there's a fictional book, there is a list that in no way can account for the population that we see here. When we look at the numbers, the math's not mathing. So let us address the actual trailer and move on from there.
When people talk about there's two founding peoples, two founding European peoples, you've got some African people in there too. 10% of them were black one time.
So this is a good point, that the Eurocentrism is an issue when it comes to talking about Canada. Obviously, it's not just English and French, which is how we're all taught it is. But an even bigger problem, or just as big a problem at least, would be the fusion of putting Africans into the mix, especially at the remiss of indigenous peoples, right? I mean, how can you acknowledge and accept, like, this is kind of one of the most racist things I've ever heard out of George Elliott Clarke, and it's amazing, because it's like, you of all people should know, especially considering if you look at any of his old works, his poetic works or what have you, back in the day, he constantly would talk about his indigenous heritage, and he wasn't saying black indigenous as if to say, well, I'm one of these foundational blacks or anything. He was actually talking very, very clearly and very sternly about his mixed heritage, as far as he sees it and understands it. Of course, that's another one who hasn't done the genealogy, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, he was talking about, well, that he was a Mi'kmaq. I've heard him say this multiple times, and that he was indigenous and black, suggesting that there is a separation between those two things. But we have to do better than that. If you feel the need to acknowledge an African presence, which again you still have not verified, and none of these people can say that they verified this, because I have verified it, and there's no African presence that would suggest or point to this being the seed for what we see today. There's no significant African presence to the point that would produce what we have today. So I'm not talking about a one-off here and a one-off there. I'm not talking about Arabs that came here back in the day. There were some Arabs that came in, that were working from northwest Africa, Moorish peoples and things like that doing trade. Okay, I'm talking about a significant African presence. Now, obviously, the problem that they're having is they're conflating black with African, aka melanated skin tones like I have, with exclusively coming from Africa, and we know that this is not the case. And he and the rest of these people should know that this isn't the case.
Giving a talk about slavery in Canada, this woman jumped up, just incensed. How dare you speak about us as if we were the same as the Americans?
The rest of the world knows nothing about Canadian slavery because we at home know nothing about Canadian slavery.
This is a beautiful point. It's a beautifully phrased point. It's unfortunate that it's true. It's unfortunate that it's incredibly true. The rest of the world knows nothing about us because we know nothing about us. And the reason we know nothing about us is because we keep spouting this nonsense. Okay? Now, our heritage, again, and part of the reason why we can't have these discussions is because we can't have these discussions honestly. And we're always having to connect with this nonsensical story of 4,000 refugees that come in through the Underground Railroad. That's the estimated amount. And then, of course, again, 4,000 black loyalists, okay, bringing you up to 8,000 people. Additionally, you have 600 so-called Jamaican Maroons who are originally indigenous anyway. But let's forget that fact for a second. We'll just leave that. Pretend that like what I said isn't true. So you got 600 of those who end up, the vast majority of which get sent out to Sierra Leone anyway. Okay, so that leaves in total, 8,000. And again, even those 8,000, if we go through their history and look at where they're coming from and who they're coming from originally, we're going to find that they definitely aren't African. That they are indigenous to the land, and they're definitely not African. However, even let's pretend that that's not true for a second. Let's pretend what I just said isn't true, and that those are all Africans. Would that be enough to substantiate the population that we had back then in Lungtig, and to create the population that we have now? Neither is true. And so this is why we have to stop spouting this nonsense, because us not knowing our history, us not knowing who and what we are, first off, it makes us look very foolish. And I'm done looking foolish at the behest of people getting money pushed into their pockets to perpetuate our downfall.
Segregation we experienced in this nation was very much akin to what happened in the USA.
The government of South Africa looked at Canada to figure out how to oppress the native population of South Africa better.
The first part of the plan was the building.
So, Dr. Clark here hit the nail on the head without even knowing that he hit the nail on the head. You see, he said, and I'm going to add to it because again, he's not being thorough enough. It wasn't only the government of South Africa, the government of Australia also. Both populations looked at the Canadian model, okay, for how to oppress their indigenous populations. Notice that they looked at that model to oppress their indigenous populations, not a foreign population that they brought from elsewhere, because that wouldn't make any sense whatsoever, right? But rather in South Africa and the British government in South Africa and the British government in Australia looked to their British elder nation in Canada, because Canada had been around since 1604, depending on how you want to deem this thing, depending on how you want to grade its existence. But they've been in our territory, working and operating since again, depending on what date you want to choose. I usually prefer 1603 for a variety of different reasons. The point is, it was the predecessor to Australia, which was beginning to be colonized in the 1700s, and South Africa, which was in the 1800s. And so, yes, they looked at Canada as the model for oppression and suppression of an indigenous population. Why? Because they did such a great job here. The thing that made it work so well in Canada as opposed to the other two locations is that in Canada, the lesson was to teach, and it borrowed from the history of the United States, that our population was not indigenous, but rather that it was supplemented from the United States and more indirectly from Africa. And perpetuating that lie, because it wasn't really created by them, it was created by the Americans, but perpetuating that lie was very advantageous to them, to the point that even though we live on indigenous lands, that the maps show, if you go back far enough into the maps show that all these historically black communities are actually on indigenous lands, and that the population wasn't removed. The indigenous population was never removed from these lands. We have, through the miseducation system, learned, through the segregated system, through the miseducation of the general population, we've learned that these are historically black communities, whatever that means. Because again, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can tell, black is referring to the pigment of our skin. However, many people have come to associate this with being exclusively from the continent of Africa, and it doesn't matter where you look on planet Earth, you will find that there are indigenous black people, whether that be in Asia, India, right, the Maldives, or maybe Melanesia, or the indigenous blacks of Australia that we mentioned a little bit earlier, in South America, etc. You're always going to find dark, melanated, pigmented people. So to call us, to associate us with Africa because of the pigment of our skin is really absurd and silly.
There's two founding better.
The first part of the plan was the building of the viaduct right on top of Hogan's Alley.
Our ancestors weren't allowed to go to schools in the neighboring white communities. So our ancestors had to build those schools themselves.
There are these huge omissions that really color your sense of history, a sense of who belongs, and a sense of who has always been here.
My family has been in Canada since 1798.
So I find that very interesting to hear say that there's talking about a sense of who belongs and who's always been here, when that's precisely the problem that you are creating with this documentary, with this docuseries, by telling people that our populations are African when they are not African, when they've never been African. We went on tour for the last couple of years. We were on tour for the last few years and spoke to our elders in the community, and the elders had many stories of their indigenous past, which is always very interesting to me, because even though this brainwashing primarily went through the last two generations of our families, the most stringent and strict brainwashing came out of that that residential schools era and of course the Indian hospitals era. Those two time periods, so when we're looking at the early, the 1900s to roughly around the 60s and to 80s, we have, these generations of forgetting, these generations of amnesia. Those peoples, despite all these situations, they could still, look back and say, wait, well, my grandfather used to go out to the fields and to the forest, and he picked off the shrubs, and he knew exactly which shrubs to pick, or how they would speak in a certain language when they knew that the white people weren't around, or what have you. The slaves wouldn't have known any languages because they died over on the boats, right? The languages, if you're coming from America, you know that they whip those out. So, your indigenous languages and furthermore that they had mixed the cultures, so people couldn't speak their languages with other people anyway. These things are inherent to an indigenous population, and teaching the indigenous population that they're a foreign population means that you wrestle out of their hands and out of their will the necessity to reclaim their land, the moral responsibility of claiming their land, because to claim any more land is theft of somebody else's land. But we've never been guilty of that, and we've never needed to be either.
So I'm a 7th generation Canadian.
Even those who don't disbelieve will often say, why do you need to talk about this? It's painful, it's hurtful. I think every generation needs to come to its own terms with human injustice.
We are standing on the shoulders of some of the bravest people to have ever lived on this planet.
And of course, that last point is definitely true. Our ancestors did amazing things. So, in that part, there's no disagreements. That's a matter of fact.